Well, hear those sleigh bells ringling, ting, ting, tingling too. Come on, it's lovely weather for a sleigh ride together with you. Hello everybody. Every now and then it gets mentioned that I am a Christian, and my entire audience says, "What? Really? A Christian?" Part of this might be in relation to my view on women's rights, which I've already covered on my main channel. But another reason people might be confused is that my whole thing is challenging trans identity specifically because it's a claim about reality that biological males can be women that hasn't been evidenced. Indeed, I've often explicitly compared it to a religious claim in this context. So if I'm saying we should reject religious or religious adjacent claims about reality that haven't been evidenced, and then I'm also saying I'm a Christian, then I must believe that there is some reason to be a Christian. And many people think there is no reason to be a Christian that could convince any rational person. Anyway, I sometimes go off on tangents in my live streams, but if I were to explain why I'm a Christian every single time somebody queries it, then that would be taking tangents to a new extreme. So from now on, this video is intended to serve as a reference for anybody wanting an answer to that question. I hope you enjoy. Before I begin, I should address an important question. Was I just raised to be religious? The answer is no. In the interests of full disclosure, I did grow up in the UK, and in the UK, it's not uncommon for local state schools to be explicitly religious. We don't do the whole separation of church and state thing here, so my first school was Christian. I also had that moment which I think is quite common for kids, when you first find out what death is, and it's terrifying. And I remember being 5 or 6 and trying to rationalize believing in heaven, specifically for that reason. Even when I was around that age though, I was still in the habit of analyzing arguments and questioning why somebody would believe something, and at that time, I encountered no reasons to believe Christianity was true, so I stopped. I will admit, just because honesty is the best policy, that I do one time remember praying to God that a girl I liked would talk to me. But even then, I remember the specific stipulation was, "I'm not sure if you exist, but if she does talk to me, then that would prove you do exist, and then I'd actually believe in you." Anyway, she didn't talk to me, so God doesn't exist, and that's the end of the video. On a serious note, this was all in the context of me attending an explicitly religious school. From age 8 onwards, I was attending secular schools, and my parents weren't religious, and the idea of God existing became something I didn't think about at all. I promise I'm not going to do the Kevin Sorbo move from God's Not Dead, where I claim I was an atheist, when in reality I always believed in God, and I was just angry at God because that's all atheists are, just people angry at God. No, I had no feelings towards God, because I didn't believe God existed, because I was an atheist. I will, however, say that when I was 14 until I was about 16, I went through the dreaded new atheist phase, with an unhealthy dose of Reddit to boot. I used Reddit exclusively for the atheism communities, read new atheist books, watched religious debates obsessively, tried to start more than a few religious debates myself, even very embarrassingly with people I knew personally at times, and was subscribed to all the prominent YouTube atheists around that time. Anyway, eventually I matured as a person back to somebody a bit more normal. Honestly, even when I was a hardcore atheist, I still maintained my ability to recognize good arguments. I was, for example, very confused why whenever I watched debates on religion, I consistently noticed that the atheists didn't do that well whenever they were up against serious Christian academics. Like, Sam Harris's debate with William Lane Craig remains probably the worst debate performance I've ever seen in a serious academic context. But anyway, after this point, I became less obnoxious with my atheism, and the only subsequent development that matters is me becoming a Christian, which is best explained by looking at the actual reasons. Before I jump into that, I'll make one important disclaimer. From here on out, I'm probably going to have some negative things to say about atheists. When I say these things, it will be a generalization. I'm not being so inclusive as to say everybody who believes God doesn't exist must be covered by these broad generalizations, but I'm also not being so restrictive as to just be talking about that particular cringe teenage Reddit atheist that I was a decade ago. I think my criticisms are more broadly applicable than that. You'll also notice that I defined an atheist as somebody who believes God doesn't exist. The reason I say that is because that's what an atheist is. That is the common academic definition, and it's also the most useful definition. I know a lot of people like to water down atheism as much as they can, to the point of saying it's just anybody who doesn't actively believe God exists, such that they would even say babies are atheists. I think that is unhelpful, and also frankly dishonest. I think it's dishonest for somebody to argue from a position that makes it clear they actively believe God doesn't exist, and then is going to turn around and say, actually, my position is just that I don't actively believe in God. If somebody neither believes that God does exist, nor that God doesn't exist, and rather doesn't claim to have sufficient knowledge to believe one way or the other, then they are an agnostic. I think that three-label system works the best, and if you're going to comment below like, actually, I'm an agnostic atheist because I don't believe in God, but I don't claim to know he doesn't exist, then I'm going to find your self-identity both irritating, unnecessary, and inaccurate. Anyway, so now you hopefully are clear on what I mean when I refer to atheists in this video. Let's talk about the famous atheist argument, everybody's an atheist about most gods, I just believe in one less god than you do. Also phrased as, I reject your god for the same reason you reject all other gods. Something I notice is that atheists simply cannot function when their go-to epic one-liner argument doesn't work. Their mind just kind of breaks. For example, one time an atheist presented that argument to me that their reason for rejecting the God of the Bible is the same as my reason for rejecting Zeus or whoever. And I thought to myself, well, the reason I reject Zeus is because I believe that biblical theology provides a conception of God that makes more sense than Greek mythology does. So I presented to them that response. So the reason you reject the God of the Bible is because you believe that your conception of God makes more theological sense. That's strange though, I thought you were an atheist. And at that point the conversation became comical because, like I say, this atheist just couldn't accept that their argument wasn't actually good, so they kept trying to get me to admit that actually my reason for rejecting Zeus was some other reason than what it was, so their argument could work, angrily insisting I lie about reality so their argument makes sense. If you're a former atheist who previously believed that atheists were reliably more intelligent and rational than theists, then it doesn't take long of having switched gears and arguing against atheists for you to be swiftly disabused of that notion. Anyway, the argument is supposed to work by me saying, I guess, well, I don't believe in Zeus because there's no evidence to believe in Zeus. And then the atheist says, well, that's why I don't believe in the God of the Bible. It's a great argument, presumably, if the Christian dutifully plays along. Before I proceed, I want to get this out of the way now and make this point clear. There is also another argument from atheists presented by Christopher Hitchens that, paraphrased, goes something like this. Even if you demonstrate God exists, you still have all your work ahead of you in demonstrating that this God is the God of the Bible. Now, I'm going to say something quite radical. I am more confident that if God exists, then this God is the God of the Bible, than I am that God exists. To use some made-up percentages, let's say I'm 95% sure that God exists. Well, in that case, I'm 99% sure that this God would be the God of the Bible. In fact, the reason I know this is because before I believed God existed, I believed that if God existed, then this God would be the God of the Bible. The belief about the specific theology came before the belief that this theology was even describing something real. So let's talk about that, and then by the end of this section, we'll circle back round to the atheist argument I started this section with. So for the rest of this section, let's just assume that God exists, and then consider who this God might be. Firstly, let's dismiss deism. Deism is the belief that God does exist, but doesn't have any sort of personal relationship with humans. In other words, in this worldview, two things are true. That all civilizations on Earth speak about some kind of relationship between God and human civilization, and also it's true that God exists. Remember, for this section we're assuming that. In a deistic worldview, these two things have nothing to do with each other. There are human civilizations with all their ideas about God's relationship with us, and then there's just some impersonal, detached God looking down like, oh wow, what a coincidence. To me, that's absurd. Of course, if a powerful immaterial consciousness exists and created us, and also we have these ideas about our relationship with this being, then the origin of our ideas about this relationship must be to some extent rooted in its reciprocity. Now also, if God exists, and also we have all these religious ideas about God, it would make sense that God has some kind of providential influence over these ideas. If God created the universe, is he really just going to let the correct religious worldview fade into obscurity? No. He'd probably orchestrate human history in such a way as to bring the specific conception of him to prominence. So that's a pretty strong case for the God of Abraham right there. Think about human history for a second and realize how much of it conveniently worked out to get us to the position today where well over half the population of the globe claims to believe in the God of Abraham. But my wording here gets to a key point. I'm saying the God of Abraham because of course that is one singular God. Just like Zeus is one god and Vishnu is one god and Quetzalcoatl is one god. But the difference between Islam and Christianity and Judaism isn't a small difference. And to me, this is why phrasing the question of choosing the right religion in terms of the identity of God is pretty wrong-headed. The question isn't whether God is this particular identity, because, I mean, heck, maybe Quetzalcoatl is actually a form that the God of Abraham took. I've heard Hindus, for example, claim that their gods might just be various personalities of the God of Abraham, and Sikhs claim similar things. So pointing to a particular religious conception of God and identifying that God really isn't important. What matters is the theological substance on offer. So how might we evaluate the theological substance? Well, I'm sorry, but the answer is by spending considerable amounts of time engaging with religious texts in good faith to make a sincere effort to understand what they're saying, and then looking at textual criticism to substantiate that, and then seeing the challenges to different theologies and evaluating them for yourself based on your own intuition about what makes sense. Let me give an example of a debate topic I submitted on the Debate Religion subreddit one time. I'll present the argument in full. In Judaism, the Messiah is viewed to be somebody who will appear and achieve a final victory for God's people. He's an end times figure who will bring about something like heaven on earth. Now, in Christianity, Jesus Christ is the Messiah, and when he first came to earth, he didn't achieve that. However, Christians still have a basis for believing Jesus is the Messiah because he did achieve something very substantial. He established a ministry that made the God of the Bible be worshipped globally, and he did have a victory on the cross whereby he atoned for all the world's sins. These are not insignificant achievements, and they are achievements one might expect of the Messiah. Indeed, considering that in the Old Testament the Messiah seems to have sometimes been presented as a victor and other times as a tragic figure, Jesus Christ would encapsulate this perfectly. Now, meanwhile, in Islam, Jesus is also considered the Messiah. However, in Islam, Jesus didn't achieve anything when he came to earth. The religion that came from Jesus is, according to Islam, a false religion, and Jesus didn't die on the cross and certainly didn't act as an atoning figure for anybody. In Islam, Jesus just showed up, preached a bit, disappeared, and left a false theology behind that would lead many people towards false religions. Thus, in Islam, there is no reason to think of Jesus as any sort of Messiah, and certainly no reason to have confidence in his supposed second coming, where he will apparently achieve something having achieved nothing initially. Now, I hope you can recognize that the argument I just made there is a good argument, and an argument that should be quite troubling for Muslims. They say Jesus is the Messiah, but they have no record of Jesus having achieved anything remotely impressive to make him worthy of that label. This is what I mean when I say that we can evaluate whether or not theologies make sense. The idea that Jesus was a Messiah who achieved a spiritual victory and founded a true religion makes sense. The idea that the Messiah is still to come and will achieve some significant earthly victory makes sense. What doesn't make sense is saying that Jesus was the Messiah but didn't achieve anything the first time he came to earth. Now, in response to this, there were some Muslims who attempted to make counters to this point. They tried to defend the Islamic idea of Jesus as a Messiah who totally failed the first time, but can be confidently trusted for his second coming. There were also some Jews who tried to argue that Jesus' first coming wasn't a significant enough achievement, and that it's just as ridiculous for Christians to have faith in Jesus' second coming. I don't think either of these arguments were particularly good, but the conversation was still good. Muslims, Jews, and Christians having intelligent conversations about different messianic prophecies and the theological substance of what it means for a religious figure to have achieved something. It's the kind of discussion you want to have if your goal is to discover theological truth. And then came the atheists, because it was Reddit and there were more than a few atheists there. And their contributions are a little different. They don't involve quoting scriptures or commentaries or academic journals. They don't involve philosophical ideas and questions that matter. Instead, what they have to say is, haha, I can't believe you guys are arguing over whose imaginary friend is real. Aren't all religions nonsense? You're arguing against Islam, but it's just as easy to argue against Christianity, and so on and so forth. The issue is that an atheist seems to not just be somebody who denies the existence of God, but also somebody who denies the entire idea of any epistemology when it comes to theology. In their view, there is simply no way of intelligently concluding that one religious claim is more credible than another. And in my view, this makes a substantial proportion of their objection to religiosity completely pointless and not worth engaging with. So let's return back to that quote. Everybody's an atheist about most gods. I just believe in one less god than you do. The reason this is a stupid objection is because it's basically arguing that if you have any specific beliefs about a larger belief, then you should abandon that larger belief. Take, for example, evolution. Let's say you believe in evolution, but you don't just believe in evolution because different evolutionary biologists disagree and to an extent have competing theories. So if you're knowledgeable on evolution, then you probably believe some things about evolution and reject other things. Now imagine that you meet a creationist and start making fun of them for rejecting evolution, whereupon they say, well, you disbelieve in all sorts of claims about evolution, I just disbelieve in one more claim than you do. You can see the issue, right? It's a stupid argument. I not only believe in God, but also care about the nature of God, so necessarily I'm going to have been invested in accepting certain claims about God and rejecting others, but in no sense is that comparable to disbelieving in any God existing. The premise of the atheist argument would seem to be that the rejection of other ideas about God isn't a result of rigorous and sincere inquiry, but rather is arbitrary. I arbitrarily rejected loads of different gods, so why not just arbitrarily reject my God? Of course, this is actually very revealing about atheism. For me, the existence and nature of God isn't some arbitrary thing, but something that requires actual thought and rationality. That atheists don't recognize that only reflects poorly on them. All of this is why nowadays I will only really debate an atheist sincerely if they can meet one prerequisite. They need to be able to tell me with confidence what they would believe about God if God did exist. Because in doing so, it will filter out all atheists who are unable to engage with the epistemology of theology. Now you might think this is unreasonable because how can an atheist have an opinion about a God they don't believe exists? To that I would firstly say that there are a lot of atheists who are very invested in arguing against Christians. If they are invested in doing it, they might want to also be invested in learning about religious claims in more detail. Frankly, I think knowing enough about religious claims to have some recognition of certain theological claims being more valid than others isn't something I should even need to insist on from people who apparently want to debate religion. Secondly, of course, it's possible to have these opinions about something you don't believe exists. I'd assume a lot of you watching don't believe God exists, and yet you were still able to recognize the argument I presented earlier about the Islamic conception of the Messiah. I don't know what part of not believing in God would cause your brain to magically turn off and become incapable of evaluating arguments, because I don't actually believe that's true. So atheists definitely should be capable of not only saying God doesn't exist, they should be able to evaluate theological arguments and come to meaningful conclusions about what theological claims about God are more likely to be true. However, I will concede that there is only one atheist I've known to do this before, and that atheist was me, shortly before I became convinced that Christianity is true. However, isn't that telling? Isn't it telling that looking into the theological arguments on display in sufficient detail to compare one to another seems to cause people to stop being atheists? I started this section off by saying that my confidence in Christianity is what motivates my confidence in the existence of God, and I hope you can begin to see why that's the case. However, so far I haven't really made a positive case for Christianity, except for that small argument given as an example. Now, of course, standard disclaimer applies that no argument I could give in this short video will substitute for the hard work of actually looking into this stuff for yourself. Nonetheless, I'll try to give a semblance of what I think is the strongest argument for Christianity, the miraculous theological coherence of the Bible. The Bible was written over a period of around 1,000 years. Traditional datings would say around 1,500 years. Liberal datings would generally say around 600 to 800 years or so. Liberal scholars tend to date the Old Testament later, but also the New Testament later as well, so it works out. Of course, having been written over hundreds of years, it was also written by dozens of authors. And in addition to this, it was doubtless edited and translated, and parts may have been lost or added over time. So with that in mind, it would already be pretty impressive if the Bible was theologically coherent. Theology is quite complicated, so you wouldn't expect a load of random disconnected authors separated by centuries to write a book that reads as one singular theological treatise. But at the same time, that's not super impressive. I mean, later authors could have specifically written their works to follow on from earlier authors. It's not that difficult. Surely this isn't my argument for the Bible being correct. Well, it's not. To get to my point, I want to again restate a point I made in conversation with a Muslim. We were talking about the Trinity and the absence of the Trinity from the Old Testament, and they said, "How can you believe in the Trinity when it is nowhere explicitly taught in the Old Testament?" And I imagine they were quite taken aback to hear me respond, not only does the absence of explicit teaching on the Trinity in the Old Testament not lessen my belief in Christianity, but actually I probably wouldn't even be a Christian if the Trinity was taught explicitly in the Old Testament. And perhaps you're taken aback to hear this too, so let me present this as a slightly more accessible line of reasoning. Now first, I should add some context. You may be wondering why the word explicitly has been specified, and the reason for this is that I had been arguing that there are many passages about God in the Old Testament that imply or hint at a Trinitarian God. Firstly, there's of course the fact that plural pronouns are used to describe God at several points in the Bible. In the very first chapter of the Bible, God says, "Let us make man in our image." There's also several grammatical moments that imply a multiplicity of persons, such as in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, where it says that God brought down fire from God in heaven. So is one singular person bringing down fire from himself here? Imagine if I was making a meal and I walked into the dining room and somebody said, "Michael brought food from Michael in the kitchen." When God appears to Abraham early on in the Bible, he appears as three men, and even the Hebrew Shema, which is supposed to be the quintessential statement of Judaic monotheism, reads, "Yahweh Eloheinu Yahweh Echad," which translates to, God, 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 one. Now I can already hear the objections. The plural pronouns are being used to convey the majesty of God, like when Queen Victoria famously said, "We are not amused." God bringing down fire from God is because God is omnipresent. The two other men with God were angels, and the repetition in the Shema is just because the Bible repeats stuff sometimes. And indeed, if you've read the Bible, you'll know the Bible repeats stuff. Repetition in the Bible is something you'll find when you read it. To read the Bible is to read the repetition of the Bible that can be found therein due to the repetition in the Bible. But that's the point. All I'm saying is that you have in these four quick examples, four things which seem to make a lot of sense if God is a Trinity. I'm not saying it's impossible that these four passages could be found in a non-Trinitarian book. I'm saying that they're certainly not out of place in a Trinitarian book. Indeed, they could readily be read as evidencing Trinitarianism within that context. But I agree that these passages and grammatical quirks aren't explicitly teaching the Trinity, and that's a strength for the Bible. Because if the Trinity was just taught explicitly in the Old Testament, then there would be nothing impressive about that. The Bible would be theologically coherent, yes, but in a way where one could simply conclude that all the authors agreed on the Trinity and were simply copying each other. However, that's not what we have in the Bible. Instead, the Trinity, first of all, is never explicitly explained in the Bible. The Trinity is simply a description of three truths that are found taught in the Bible. That there is one God, that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are all God, and that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are distinct persons. As David Wood puts it, Christians believe in the Trinity because the triune God forces us to. We don't desire to believe in it for emotional reasons. We don't get some great pleasure out of believing it. We believe it because God reveals himself in the Bible, and what he reveals tells us that he is one God and three distinct persons. But of course, these explicit statements are only found in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, there doesn't seem to be any apparent belief in the Trinity, and yet somehow there are verses and passages in the Old Testament that perfectly line up with the Trinity. This isn't a book that says God is a Trinity and then just spends 2,000 pages agreeing with itself across an authorship period of 1,500 years. This is a book that says nothing about the Trinity until the last 100 years of its authorship, and yet somehow the first 1,400 years corroborate that with innumerable hints to God's triune or multi-personal nature. And this isn't the only example of this. I've already mentioned how there are several prophecies in the Old Testament that are either explicitly messianic, or at least can be very credibly be read as messianic, that present the Messiah as somebody who might actually suffer at the hands of his enemies. But again, the Old Testament doesn't come out and explicitly say, there will be a guy who appears, who will be God, and will die on the cross for our sins, and in doing so, win a victory over sin. The Bible does, however, say, in Isaiah, "But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we were healed." Elsewhere in Isaiah it says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Christians read this and see not a promise that would have been obvious to Jews at the time of Jesus' coming, but rather hints within a broader messianic prophecy of Jesus Christ's role as the true Messiah. For another example, let's jump right back to Genesis. I mean, we could talk about how Genesis ends with Joseph being sold out to the dominant power of the ancient Near East at the end, only to then end up saving the world from death and summarizing his life by saying, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Definitely no foreshadowing there. But I want to go back even further to the Garden of Eden. After Adam and Eve betray God, God says to the snake, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." To a Jew now, and to a Jewish audience at the time, this was read as simply describing the fact that most humans don't like snakes and view them with fear. However, a Christian reads this and thinks, so the snake, which represents human rebellion and death, will be crushed by a child of a woman, but this child will then be wounded as a result of this. Who does that remind us of? So there are a few examples among many of how you can read the Old Testament as a Christian and see all sorts of ideas that seem to line up perfectly with Christian theology. Now at this point, if you're an atheist, you're probably thinking something along the lines of, well, of course, Michael, of course. How do you even begin to think this is impressive? Everybody knows that the Bible can be interpreted to say basically anything. This is again a demonstration of the typical atheist belief that there is no such thing as theological epistemology, even though I would hope that to any thinking person it wouldn't be that hard to delineate between a reasonable and intelligent interpretation of a text and a completely off-the-wall interpretation. This seems to be a delineation that atheists insist can't be meaningfully made. To me, there are certainly multiple different interpretations of the Bible that are all potentially valid. It's not obviously true that God's comment to the serpent is describing Jesus, but it's also not obviously true that it isn't. A proper interpretation of the Bible should of course be holistic, so we would interpret texts in light of other texts, and that allows us to see what one text is likely saying. But does this interpretation stuff really offer up a free pass for any religion to lay claim to another religious text by simply interpreting it to fit? Well, this really isn't such a difficult question to answer, because one of the largest religions in the world already attempts this out of obligation. See, in the Quran it declares, "Those who follow the messenger, the unlettered prophet, whom they find written in what they have of the Torah and of the Gospel." So there we go, a clear claim from the Quran that we find Muhammad mentioned in the Torah and the Gospel. So apparently it's super easy to interpret religious scripture to just match with whatever religious claim you want to make. You want to claim that Muhammad is found in the Bible? Well, it shouldn't be too hard to interpret that, right? Well, let's evaluate the interpretations Muslims offer. Now, I can't evaluate every claim, so I will just stick with the three that are most commonly mentioned and often included in tafsirs or Islamic scriptural commentaries. These are found in Deuteronomy, John, and Isaiah. So the first supporting verse is Deuteronomy 18:15. "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." Now immediately there's the issue that this seems to be saying the prophet will be raised up from among the Israelites, whereas Muhammad was an Arab. To this, Muslims will say that Arabic and Hebrew are both Semitic languages, so therefore the Arabs were the brothers of the Hebrews, and that's what it means. Alright, fine. That's a valid interpretation of the phrase, from your brothers. Now, there's also the fact that in Deuteronomy 34, a little later on, the text goes on to say, "And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, none like him, for all the signs and the wonders that the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt." So this seems to be referring to Moses' many famous miracles. This is one explicit example of what it means to be a prophet like Moses. However, Muhammad is not famous for his miracles at all. Muhammad also never knew God face to face. So even based on the explicitly provided substance of what it means to be a prophet like Moses, Muhammad fails. Finally, it shouldn't go unsaid that there is no positive reason given to think of Muhammad as this prophet like Moses in contrast to literally any other self-proclaimed prophet. Next, let's look at John 14:16-17, which reads, "And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper, to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive, because it neither sees him nor knows him. You know him, for he dwells with you and will be in you." Now, the argument here would be that the helper is Muhammad. But the funny thing about this one is that I don't even need to go to other verses in this passage to argue against this being Muhammad, although I could. But just what we're told in these two verses here tells us that Muhammad will be with Jesus' disciples. This isn't true, because Muhammad didn't appear until 5 centuries after Jesus' disciples had all died. It says that Muhammad will be with them forever, which also isn't true because Muhammad lives on earth for a human lifespan and then died. It claims that Muhammad is a spirit, which isn't true. It claims Muhammad cannot be received by the world. This isn't true, since Muhammad was a human of flesh and blood, born into the world, and was even an earthly conqueror. It claims Muhammad cannot be seen by the world, but Muhammad wasn't invisible. It claims Muhammad cannot be known by the world, but we have earthly accounts of Muhammad, even if they are from 2 centuries after his supposed lifetime. It then says that Jesus' disciples know Muhammad, but they don't, and also says that Muhammad dwells with them, which he didn't, and that he dwells inside them, which he definitely didn't because he was a human being. The Christian interpretation of this text is that the helper being sent is the Holy Spirit. The Muslim interpretation is that this is Muhammad. I challenge any atheist to still uphold their conviction that we can't say certain religious interpretations are more credible than others. Finally, let's look at Isaiah 42. I'm saving this for last because it's actually the strongest case, and it also involved looking at the whole chapter holistically. The main argument for Isaiah 42 referring to Muhammad are that a few religious terms are used that are also names used by Muhammad, such as servant and chosen one. Okay, so this is sort of nothing considering that these terms are used all the time in religious contexts, so it's not surprising that there is one chapter of the Bible that uses these terms to describe somebody, and Muhammad also had these names associated with him. The next argument focuses more on the location of Muhammad and draws on verse 11. "Let the desert and its cities lift up their voice. The villages that Kedar inhabits, let the inhabitants of Selah sing for joy. Let them shout from the top of the mountains." The argument being that Kedar is in Arabia, and there is also a mountain in Medina called Selah. Now, the Kedar point is quite easily dismissed. The Bible was written in the Middle East, so of course it will refer to places in the Arabian Peninsula. Significantly though, Kedar is in the very north of the Arabian Peninsula, very far from where Muhammad was supposedly active. Moreover, the verse before this makes reference to the coastlands and the sea. It's very clear that this is simply an example of the Bible doing something it often does, which is referring to multiple locations to describe the whole world. It's basically saying, from the coastlands and the sea, all the way to the desert. I'm not saying this reference to Kedar is nothing, but it's not much more than just the Bible mentioning a nearby place. Salah is the only interesting reference, because while there is also an area called Salah in Edom, which is probably what the text was referring to, it is interesting that there's also a mountain of Salah in Medina, and that could serve to identify Muhammad. Again, there is an issue that elsewhere in Isaiah 42, it clearly refers to this person sent by God being a meek and passive person, which is not how Muhammad is portrayed in Islamic history. However, it's still a slight hint at Muhammad, and indeed I would happily read it as a prophecy of Muhammad. if it was one of many prophecies that appear to be predicting his coming. In reality, the precise opposite is true. And this is where I get to the big point. Whether there are these occasional verses and passages that could be read as prophesying Muhammad, there's still the fact that huge chunks of the Bible contradict Islam. The Gospel of John, where the passage about the Helper can be found, starts off by saying that God became flesh and dwelt among us. Muslims don't believe that. Of course, all of this is made more awkward for Muslims when considering that Surah 547 actually commands Muslims to assess the Quran by seeing whether it matches up with the Gospel. Ultimately, it's kind of shocking that in a text as expansive as the Bible, Muslims are only capable of finding a handful of verses that they can even attempt to offer up as validating Islam, but any appeal they make to the Bible is undercut by the fact they will reject any verse they don't like as simply corruption. There are many religions that claim to be following on from the Bible, and yet all the ones that aren't Trinitarian share a common feature. They will desperately hand-wave away a lot of the Bible because it disagrees with them. Muslims reject the majority of the Bible as corrupt because a lot of its core theological premises disagree with Islam. Meanwhile, you have other groups like Mormons who believe in a succession of gods who just have to hand-wave away clear verses like in Isaiah 43:10, where it says, "Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be any after me." There's not really any way to reinterpret that to make it compatible with its precise contradiction, so Mormons say that the Bible is a corrupt book. And when you realize that every other religion that tries to co-opt the Bible has to do so while cherry-picking and calling certain verses corrupt if they're inconvenient, you realize the miracle of the Bible's theological coherence. Because this is the miracle. The Bible is one singular book. Most Christian churches typically have in each service a reading from the Old Testament and a reading from the New Testament. When Christians do Bible studies, there isn't this sense of reading suddenly a very distinct book when reading the Old Testament. There is nothing in the Old Testament that theologically troubles Christians. In fact, there's possibly more stuff in the New Testament that causes confusion amongst Christians than in the Old Testament. Christians love the Old Testament. They take it as sacred and an inerrant authority. Christians don't read the Old Testament wincing at how inconvenient it is for Christian theology, because it isn't. I'm reminded of a story of a Jewish convert to Christianity who had some not very serious Jewish family members who thought he was stupid to follow Jesus Christ. So one day he read the suffering servant passage from Isaiah, and his Jewish relative said, "Why should I believe that though? The New Testament is a false book." To which the Christian convert informed them that this passage from Isaiah, while so clearly talking about Jesus as to be readily identified by anybody hearing it as being about Jesus, is in fact from the Old Testament. Now, for the record, I'm aware this story is a little too "and then everyone clapped" to actually be true, but it does get to a very real point. Christians teach the Old Testament just as ardently as we teach the New. In fact, I think that Christians actually find more theological substance in the Old Testament than Jews do. I don't think there is any theological substance in the Old Testament that Christians reject. Plenty of churches do sermons where they work their way week by week through entire books of the Old Testament, and they explore in great depth every single verse to get at that meaning. Muslims, by the way, can't do that. You saw what happened when we went through the verses that Muslims appeal to for their religion and go through them in detail. It falls apart. For Christianity, this isn't true. But I say that Christians find even more theological substance because, take for example that story of the Garden of Eden. For a Jewish reader, it really is just describing the relationship between human beings and snakes. There isn't that much else to it. However, for a Christian, there is a huge theological depth to that passage because it is the first foretelling of Christ's death on the cross as a wounded victor against human rebellion. The son of woman represents Christ, the serpent represents human rebellion, and the crushed head represents atonement, justification, and sanctification, and the wounded heel represents Christ's death. And to me, that is a miracle, and it's something that I sincerely cannot explain naturalistically. I don't know how it can be true that every other religion that has tried to do this has failed and ended up having to discreetly sweep a lot of the texts they claim to agree with under the rug. And yet, meanwhile, Christianity is able to take this book that was written by dozens of Jews over a period of hundreds of years and stand by it so resolutely. I actually believe that it's also hard to explain how Islam is so incapable of backing up their religion, even with cherry-picked verses, other than that it's divine intervention at work. And I don't envy the task of the atheist here to rationalize this. They have to somehow believe that matching one's theology to a religious text is so easy that Christians are able to do it effortlessly, while simultaneously so hard that Muslims aren't able to do it pretty much at all. I wouldn't want to try to explain that without appealing to divine providence, and I'm glad I don't have to. One quick disclaimer I couldn't put in elsewhere. I'm not claiming that there are no problematic verses in the Old Testament from a modern Christian perspective. There are obviously some morally questionable actions and laws, as well as scientific inaccuracies, but these aren't theological issues for Christians. I've seen atheists claim that reading the Bible will turn you atheist. Honestly, I have to confess that I doubt the claim of most atheists that they have read the Bible. I think they've maybe Googled top 10 stupid Bible verses, but most of them, I suspect, haven't read the Bible from cover to cover. However, what I am even more confident in saying is that a very, very few atheists have actually studied the Bible with a sincere effort to understand it. For my part, I read the Bible, I understood it, and it was even as I came to understand it that I came to recognize the intrinsic miracle of its content, and that convinced me that there must be a divine reason for this, and that this is the God of the Bible, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now, I do have some other reasons for believing in God that I will go through briefly. These aren't my main reasons for believing in God, nor are they my only reasons, but they're middle-tier reasons that, for that reason, warrant a mention. Firstly is the origin of the universe. The universe is temporal and material, and it seems that which is temporal and material requires a cause. Obviously, if the cause of the temporal material universe was also temporal and material, then that would create an infinite loop. So we have to conclude that what created our material and temporal universe was itself immaterial and intemporal. Now, for an immaterial and intemporal thing to create the material world, it would have to have control over the world, and also a conscious mind would be the only being capable of the agency to decide to create a world. So a conscious mind outside of space and time with control over space and time sounds like God to me. Now, the strength of this argument is that it does avoid the question of who created God, because the entire basis for the argument is that God is the only thing that wouldn't need a creator. I do think it makes a pretty strong case for the existence of the supernatural and something beyond just the natural world. However, the final point about a conscious mind having agency is a little bit tacked on, and I don't think sufficiently rules out the possibility of an unconscious immaterial force creating the universe. Speaking of consciousness though, that's actually my next reason for believing in God. I would state the argument thusly. Considering how significant consciousness is in reality, it would make sense for me to imagine that consciousness has a privileged place within reality. So the first point about consciousness being significant in reality seems kind of self-evident to me. Realize for a second that without consciousness, nothing looks like anything, or sounds like anything, or smells like anything. Without consciousness, the world is just atoms. Atoms that don't even have an appearance. It would be such a profoundly empty reality. And that's before even getting into judgments. So not only would things like appearance and sound not exist in this universe, but also normative claims about beauty and aesthetic value or morality or the emotional effect of any experience. Without consciousness, the universe would be so much less. Imagine a world where there is just matter, and there is no consciousness to sense it or appraise it in any sense, and then realize how drastic the contrast is between that world and the world we actually inhabit, where we can see things and hear things and smell things and appreciate their beauty, and we can recognize particular actions as right or wrong and exciting or bland and funny or serious. Consciousness is no small part of our reality. And yet, in an atheistic worldview, consciousness is just an accident that emerged from unconscious material dynamics. Neil deGrasse Tyson once said, "We are the universe experiencing itself." Now, I certainly agree with that, but what I struggle to agree with is the suggestion that the universe is experiencing itself by mistake. Go outside and just take in the beauty of the world for a while. Really take it in, everything, and then reflect on the suggestion that this conscious experience of reality does not exist any higher up on the cosmic hierarchy than us. And ask yourself if that makes sense. For me, considering how much consciousness means to material reality and how significant the interface is between material reality and consciousness, I cannot imagine that material reality does not itself emanate from some sort of consciousness. And the final reason I believe in God is personal experience. I have felt God's presence in my life. Now, the standard response to this would probably be to say, well, what about people of other religions? But, I hope at this point it's clear that the existence of other religions isn't an issue for me. The alternative people might say is, well, what if I have a dream that I'm going to win the lottery? Does that mean I will actually win? People who argue this, I don't think understand the argument. The argument isn't that the substance of what's being communicated is true, but rather that if anything is being communicated, then that suggests the existence of a communicator. I'll also say that my personal experience in life has inclined me towards believing in God as I've just observed society. I've mentioned before on my channel the idea of presuppositionalism, which simply stated asserts that the existence of God is the strongest foundation for believing that we can understand the universe and we should want to. If you follow my YouTube presence more generally, then you're probably aware that there are a lot of people who seem to believe that we can't know anything and shouldn't want to know anything. Maybe there is some credibility to the idea that atheism isn't the fount of all reason and knowledge. Batteries flashing, let's see if we can power through. Since I hate my future self who's going to have to read this whole script, let's address very briefly some counterpoints to Christianity. To restrict how much I permit myself to say, I'll be sure to bullet point it. 1. Doesn't the Bible have some bad stuff in it? Yeah, it does. I addressed this on my main channel with regards to gender. The simple answer is that the Bible does have a slightly different morality than your average modern person, and that's just the reality of the situation. Doesn't make it not true. 2. Isn't the Bible full of scientific inaccuracies? The Bible isn't a science textbook. It's a theological work. The theological claim made in Genesis is that God created the earth. That is true. Whether he created it in 6 days 6,000 years ago is irrelevant. 3. Isn't the Bible full of contradictions? Most supposed contradictions are based on incredibly uncharitable interpretations. I'm not going to say there are 0 contradictions in the Bible, but the idea that the Bible is this tangled mess of innumerable contradictions doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Like, if you actually look at one of the sources that lists huge numbers of biblical contradictions, you quickly realize how few of them actually are contradictions. 4. Isn't the Bible unreliable due to textual criticism? The Bible being authored by loads of people and changed isn't an issue if you understand God's role in preserving the Bible, which extends to making sure that additions won't cause the text to depart from its core meaning. And one of the most prominent atheist New Testament critics is Bart Ehrman, who has said that the textual variants in the Bible don't affect any core Christian doctrine. 5. Wasn't Christianity spread by the sword? To duplicate my references, Bart Ehrman has actually argued that Christianity would have come to dominate Europe even if it had never been adopted by the Roman Empire. It grew rapidly while being persecuted. Some people spread it by the sword at some points, but considering it often spread while being violently persecuted, there is no reason to think Christianity spread by the sword. Well, I had to change battery. 6. Aren't a lot of Christians fake and insincere? Yes, that's true. Don't evaluate the Bible by looking to the behavior of supposed Christians. Evaluate the Bible by looking at the Bible. Okay, so for this question, I'll depart from the bullet point format. What about evil? What about Stephen Fry's video where he talks about that worm that burrows into people's eyes and makes them blind? Doesn't that show that God doesn't exist because there's an organism that Stephen Fry doesn't like? I tend to respond to this with the Job approach, or alternatively the Terrence Malick film Tree of Life. Basically, you need to view the world from a cosmic perspective in order to place these events in their appropriate context. I wouldn't explicitly say that there is a greater plan, because I don't think evil has so much of an instrumental function. Rather, I would say that evil is simply part of having a more complete human experience within the context of which we can better relate to each other and God. In fact, I would go further than saying evil doesn't have an instrumental function. I would say that it is necessary for its existence as evil that it has no such instrumental function. This is the whole point of the book of Job. Lots of evil happened to him, and he didn't deserve it, and there ultimately wasn't any real justification for it. The funny thing is, if I could justify evil, then that would almost be more horrific. Like, when something evil is happening to me, I take comfort in the knowledge that it's ultimately not okay, that it is bad. And sure, there are positives to it often, like how I can use it to build my character, but I'm not basing my resolve against evil in some effort to justify evil as something that might actually be good. Rather, I'm basing my resolve against evil in the belief that there is sincere, unadulterated good out there that I can cling to. I don't need to be out here justifying evil. The closest I would get to justifying evil is making the point that God is a God of order, and he is not a cosmic genie that just magically kisses all our boo-boos better. God created a universe of rules and order, and he only ever breaks that in very exceptional circumstances. So absent those exceptional circumstances, the universe is just going to keep chugging along, and that might mean some creatures evolve to have life cycles that we will find unsavory. That's how it is. I guess I should confront the Epicurean dilemma more directly. Is God unwilling to prevent evil, or is he unable? I guess I'd say he's kind of unable to, in that he is unable to contradict his core nature when it comes to things like order, but I'd also say he's kind of unwilling in that he is willing to simply allow evil to exist as evil. I don't really accept the premise that a necessary part of God being good would be for him to wholly eradicate evil from existence. For me, the problem of evil isn't really much of a problem, but I will say that the problem of evil pales in comparison to the problem of hell. If hell is genuinely a place of eternal torment for all those who aren't saved via the gospel, then that is a very troubling reality. I'm sure you don't need me to elaborate on why. My solution then to this troubling reality is sort of just to ignore it, because it's in the afterlife. What I would say is that one of my key points in this video has been that the Bible is full of texts that you might initially interpret one way, but as the full plan of God is revealed, you suddenly realize that the text had a different meaning. That is what I tend to think about heaven and hell. I don't know what more is to be revealed. I don't think we're at the end of God's revelation, and I strongly suspect that what will be revealed about heaven and hell will be some sort of twist not readily read into the text presently. My preference is to focus on the here and now. God exists. We have the Bible in which he's revealed himself. He has a plan for how we should treat each other and treat ourselves, and all of us have fallen short of this plan. God came to earth as Jesus Christ. He was as human as you or me, and he lived a perfect life, and yet despite that he died on the cross, and when he did so, he took upon himself the punishment for everybody's sins. So right now, you can be reconciled to God by recognizing what he did for you on the cross, and you can feel his presence in your life every day until you die. After that, I'm not totally sure what to expect, but I do know about the here and now of being a Christian and having that relationship with God, and I can't recommend it enough. The main purpose of this video was to explain why I believe, for the benefit of the many people who have wondered, often aloud, why it is that somebody they generally regard as quite intelligent and rational can hold to beliefs that they believe to be so unintelligent and irrational. The purpose of this video was to defend my faith, not to evangelize to you. However, I think I've ended up evangelizing to you anyway, despite myself, and thus I guess I should say if you want to know more, I'd recommend the following resources. For learning about the Bible Project, as well as lectures by its creator, Tim Mackey. For comparative religious studies, David Wood is a pretty good resource. For hearing the gospel preached plainly in a church setting, Ralph Yankee Arnold Ministries. And of course, I'd recommend you read the Bible. 3 good books to start with are Isaiah, the Gospel of John, and the letters to the Romans. But honestly, it's all pretty good. And finally, Merry Christmas.